He was born in Iowa, the son of an Army soldier. As a boy, he took to basketball, but it was a ride in a small airplane that would eventually fuel his love of aviation. Later, at the University of Iowa, his desire to fly became a reality. He was awarded his pilot's license through an Air Force ROTC program. It made such an impact that he set out to make the Air Force and flying a career that would span more than 3 decades, from bombing runs over North Vietnam to commanding the most successful air campaign in military history, Operation Desert Storm. His name is Charles A. Horner, and he is a legend of air power. Charles Albert Horner was born in Davenport, Iowa, on October 19, 1936, to Ike, an attorney and Army soldier during World Wars I and II, and Mildred Baker Horner. Young Chuck grew up in the smaller community of Centerville, Iowa, where he spent much of his time on his grandfather's farm. It was during those days that he got a chance to ride in a light airplane, and from then on, he knew he wanted to fly. Chuck went on to high school, where he was active in sports, but it was at the University of Iowa where 2 important events would shape his destiny. He began dating his future wife, Mary Jo, and he was awarded his pilot's license through an Air Force ROTC flight program. From that point on, he pursued his passions. Soon after graduating from college with a degree in general science, Chuck Horner was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Air Force, and later that year, he was married to Mary Jo. Capping off a busy year, he applied and was accepted to pilot training, which he completed in 1959.
Probably the proudest moment of my life, other than when I got married to my wife, Mary Jo, was the day that I got those wings pinned on my chest. Because I'd worked so hard, I'd survived so much, and it was the beginning of my life for me.
At that time, most of the flying jobs in the Air Force were bomber slots. But Chuck knew he wanted to fly jet fighters. So he opted for an assignment overseas in England, where he could cut his teeth flying the F-100 fighter. 3 years later, the newly promoted Captain Horner returned to the United States with valuable fighter training and experience under his belt. But he felt something was missing. He had never experienced aerial combat. So he set his sights on changing that. The year was 1965, and America was firmly embroiled in the Vietnam conflict. U.S. troops in Southeast Asia were increasing in number, and some were coming home as casualties. Public opinion ran against American intervention in the war. President Lyndon Johnson's response? Escalate the bombing.
The basic message of the anti-war protesters was, let's get out, let's go home. Let's not be fighting where we're not wanted. There still was a lot of disruption at home, especially on college campuses, especially among young people. There were a lot of young men worried about the draft. Some wanted to run away to Canada, some wanted to go to jail, some were willing to go to Vietnam. There was a lot of division.
Meanwhile, Captain Horner was yearning for an assignment in the bombing campaign against the North Vietnamese. He saw it as a way to gain the aerial combat experience he so badly desired. He would get his wish in June of 1965, a 4-month assignment in Karat, Thailand.
I got that chance to go to combat, and that's what every pilot wants to do. They want to go. I mean, it's their Super Bowl. They train all their lives to play, and they want to go to war.
But Chuck would have to wait. The pilots in the established squadrons flew all of the combat missions, and they did not want to share the workload. That didn't last long, however. His squadron was steadily losing pilots, and they needed replacements.
My first mission was against an oil refinery at Vinh in North Vietnam. We rolled in, I laid my bombs right through the refinery area where they processed the fuel. And then out of the corner of my eye, as I'm looking off to my right, I see these yellow tracers go by the canopy, and then I realized they were trying to kill me. They were trying to shoot me. Well, they had a right to do that because of what I'd done to them. And I think that sort of took the glamour out of war for me, but it didn't take the exhilaration, because I can tell you, there's nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at and missed.
And so the bombing runs continued, but they would soon come to an end. It turned out that the Air Force no longer wanted Captain Horner to fly combat missions. They wanted him to train others to do it instead. So he returned to the U.S. and began his next assignment as an instructor pilot at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, Nevada. But he still desired to return to Vietnam. "1967 saw the continued escalation of the Vietnam conflict. The war was a hot topic in the news media, and public opinion on American intervention in the war was increasingly negative. Amidst it all, Captain Horner was doing everything he could to get back into the war and build on the combat experience he learned at Korat in 1965. His second chance came in May of 1967 as part of what was called the Wild Weasel program. It was a riskier assignment than the typical bombing mission. Wild Weasel pilots deliberately drew anti-aircraft fire from North Vietnamese surface-to-air missiles known as SAMs so they could be identified and destroyed.
It was kind of like a mongoose fighting a cobra. The cobra being the SAM site, the mongoose being this airplane flittering around, dodging missiles, going in and shooting up the SAM site. And at that time, if you were a weasel, you were pretty well guaranteed you were going to die.
Despite the fact that he wanted to be in Vietnam, Captain Horner realized that the U.S. government's intentions were different from his own.
The second time I was there, I realized that we weren't in this war to win it. We were in this war to make some sort of show of containing communism. And one of the things that we learned in the Air Force that's very, very important, and the Navy, is that you can only have one air commander. You need to have someone set the strategy for all the air elements.
It was that same strategic vision that propelled Captain Horner into the next stage of his career. He left North Vietnam for the last time in September of 1967 and was assigned to a new operation called the Fighter Weapons Center. There, he worked to elevate fighter aviation by assisting in the development of new radar bombing and rapid targeting techniques. He would later take that base of knowledge to the Pentagon, where, as part of a select team of strategists and planners, he helped to create and implement some of the most important elements of the Air Force's mission. Elements such as aggressor squadrons, groups of fighters modeled on Russian aerial tactics, AWACS, airborne surveillance operation centers with multi-mode radar that could distinguish between maritime and airborne targets, and perhaps most notably, the establishment of Red Flag, the Aerial Combat Training Center for top Air Force pilots. The Air Force version of the Navy's Top Gun, Red Flag's aim was to raise the sliding kill ratio of U.S. warplanes over enemy aircraft.
From that little group of people, we created a whole new attitude towards intelligence and how to exploit it, towards how you use your fighter forces and packages and things of this nature.
As Chuck Horner's experience grew, so did his rank. The newly promoted colonel served in a number of positions over the next 15 years, from a stint at the National War College to commanding fighter wings. Even as he rose through the general officer ranks, he continued to fly fighters and to learn about air power. All of these experiences would form the basis for the biggest campaign of Chuck Horner's life. Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded the oil-rich neighboring country of Kuwait and announced it as an annex of Iraq, sending Kuwait's ruling emir fleeing to Saudi Arabia. One of Hussein's first acts as the new ruler was to install the Provisional Free Government of Kuwait, which in turn made its top priority the confiscation of the emir's family assets. The international community was caught off guard.
The day that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, nothing happened in this country. We were serene. I think we were caught so much by surprise, we didn't know what to do. Fortunately, Margaret Thatcher and George Bush were meeting in Aspen on another matter, and so that sort of energized the process about a coalition responding to this threat.
Saudi Arabia braced for a possible invasion and turned to the United States for help. It was up to the U.S. military to prepare a response, and leading the charge was Army General Norman Schwarzkopf. Despite a violent temper that earned him the nickname Stormin' Norman, Schwarzkopf had a head for military strategy. He had even predicted an Iraqi invasion of Kuwait almost a year before it happened.
He noticed that from the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq emerged with a huge, powerful military, Army, Navy, and Air Force, particularly its Army and Air Force. And it was deeply in debt. So what do if you have a big gun and no money? You go find a bank. And of course, the bank being Kuwait.
Schwarzkopf also understood the role of each of the armed services in a military operation. Building a leadership team to address the brewing situation in the Middle East, he called his good friend, General Chuck Horner.
The following Friday, the invasion occurred Wednesday night. That next Friday, I was flying up to Langley in my F-16, and I got a recall. I knew what it was, went back home, went to my office and called General Schwarzkopf. He said, Chuck, can you come down? We need to brief the president, and I need some inputs for air. And we worked all night on a briefing. And the first part of the briefing is how we would respond to an Iraqi invasion into Saudi Arabia with our ground forces, and then I briefed what our air forces would do.
The briefing for President Bush and his cabinet marked the beginning of America's military strategy in the Gulf. Soon after, an international coalition comprised mainly of American forces was dispatched to the region. The deployment was called Operation Desert Shield and quickly became America's biggest military endeavor since Vietnam. But there was still a bigger task ahead. If Saddam Hussein refused to withdraw his military from Kuwait, the coalition forces would need to be ready with an attack plan. General Horner felt strongly that air power could do more than just support ground forces. It could also be part of an offensive attack. General Schwarzkopf would have to be convinced.
One of Schwarzkopf's main motivation is how do I keep my soldiers from dying needlessly? And so he listened intently when I talked about strategic air operations. Really, it's offensive air operations. As a result, when he left me at Jeddah, he says, I'm going back to the States, and he says, I'm going to ask the Joint Staff to build an air campaign for a strategic operation against Iraq.
With the green light given to strategic offensive air power, General Horner and his aides turned to building an attack plan from the collection of targets picked in Washington.
We took that plan, and we showed how we would gain control of the air over Iraq. We showed how we would cripple their nuclear, biological, and chemical capabilities. We show how we would then cause the Iraqi army to lose its capacity to inflict casualties on our ground forces when the ground war started to liberate Kuwait. Schwarzkopf loved it. He bought it all the way. And for the first time, air power was the driving strategy for a war.
That driving strategy became Desert Storm, an air plan working in conjunction with a ground plan. U.S.-led coalition forces spent the next several months building up for a potential military conflict with Iraq, and by the second week of January 1991, they were ready for action. President Bush made one last diplomatic attempt to end the conflict by issuing an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein. Withdraw your military from Kuwait by January 15th or suffer the consequences. In anticipation of the impending air attack, General Schwarzkopf called on General Horner.
General Schwarzkopf came to me and he says, when do you want to start the war? The thing we used to decide when to start the war was we were employing stealth F-117 fighter planes for the first time really in heavy combat. To give them the best chance of survival, we picked the darkest night of the year to start the war. And that's why January 17th, Riyadh time, is why Desert Storm kicked off.
What followed was an intense bombing campaign by the American-led coalition air power.
You'll be able to count each bomb.
Saddam Hussein's command and control centers, weapons storage sites, troop installations, supply lines, and integrated air defenses were systematically destroyed.
One of the major themes within the United States Air Force has always been the idea of precision attack. We developed means of using laser-guided weaponry where you could use a laser beam to designate a target, and then you could launch a weapon that would lock onto the spot of that laser and hit that target precisely.
We were surprised during Desert Storm. We were doing very well, and we were suddenly plinking tanks, taking the Iraqi apart a piece at a time, killing the tanks and artillery. We'd gotten control of the air. We'd gotten the nuclear, biological, and chemical that we knew about. And pretty soon, he became aware of the fact that we were dismantling his army in place on the battlefield. And we were only enduring 1 or 2 casualties a day, and they were airmen. So as a result, he had to do something. He had to generate a ground war.
After enduring 10 days of unrelenting airstrikes, Saddam Hussein made a desperate attempt to draw the coalition forces into a surprise ground attack by mobilizing 3 divisions of armor and infantry units toward the Saudi border town of El Khafji. Saddam hoped that this threat would draw Allied forces into his lair, where heavy casualties could be inflicted from carefully prepared defensive positions. But U.S. air power wasn't just limited to precision weapons delivery. An experimental airborne radar intelligence system called Joint STARS made its wartime debut and successfully thwarted Saddam's plan.
On the night of 27, our Joint STARS aircraft, which was an experimental airplane, which had a radar that could see objects moving on the ground, started generating hundreds of targets, and we would just pour air into them. And what we were doing is we were catching convoys of Iraqi tanks and armored personnel carrier and trucks that were trying to form up a 3-division attack into Saudi Arabia.
Joint STARS provided real-time radar intelligence into the cockpit, giving pilots an active view of the advancing threat and even allowing them to attack Iraqi armor in darkness and adverse weather. The depleted Iraqi forces that made it to El Khafji were met by a prepared defense of U.S. Marines and Islamic troops. The element of surprise was gone. Iraq's grossly overmatched divisions could not successfully carry out their attack. Saddam's biggest attempt at an offensive maneuver had been foiled by air power. His military was forced to abandon their battle plan within 48 hours of reaching El Khafji.
There's the whole question of, was Desert Storm the last great conventional war, or was it the first of a new series of revolutionary wars? And I think my answer is that it's a transitional conflict. It's a conflict in which you see some of the aspects of an older form of warfare and many of the aspects of a newer form of warfare. So to this degree, I would say that it's more revolutionary than evolutionary as a conflict. What to me is remarkable about Desert Storm is the fact that we saw here the tremendous payoff that the Air Force investment in precision and stealth gave the nation.
The air attacks against the Iraqis continued for another 3 weeks. And then on the night of February 24th, 1991, Allied forces began their ground offensive. It was too much for Saddam's debilitated military to handle. In just 4 days, U.S.-led coalition forces liberated Kuwait from Iraqi rule. Offensive air power had proven its dominance on the battlefield. But most importantly, it saved lives.
And I think the record shows that when our ground forces attacked the Iraqi army, defeated 42 divisions, and only lost 150 killed Americans, there's never anything like that in history.
Charles Horner was a marvelous air commander in the Desert Storm War. He ran a great operation, and he did it calmly and efficiently, with a proper and large regard for his troops, and got it done. Presided over some great air tasking orders, orchestrated an air campaign that was just hugely effective, and that won that war.
On the heels of his great Desert Storm victory, General Horner was promoted to 4 stars and named commander of the Air Force Space Command. He was put in charge of a new mission to improve America's space-based defense and declining satellite launch capabilities. During his tenure at the Air Force Space Command, the number of on-time American satellite launches improved 30%. But while the United States remains one of the leaders in space-based technology, unreliable access keeps it a largely untapped frontier, a concern General Horner outlined in this interview with the Air and Space Report.
The future is in space, and a nation, to be a modern nation, needs to be a spacefaring nation. And so we need to develop efficient, reliable, responsive access to space, and in doing so, we'll develop the industry, the jobs, and the technologies that go with it.
The now retired General Horner has since turned his attention to other pursuits. In 1999, he co-authored Every Man a Tiger, an account of air power in the Gulf War with novelist Tom Clancy. And although they're not fighters, he still enjoys flying.
And my wife says sometimes that I love my airplane more than I love her. I love the Air Force more than I love her. And I tell her, well, at least I love you more than I love the Army.
But he leaves behind him a legacy that will not soon be forgotten. From bombing runs over Vietnam to victory over the Iraqis in the desert, to helping our national defense move forward through space-based technology. For these reasons, General Chuck Horner gives Americans a reason to once again feel good about their military.
And so I found probably the most important thing about my career as I look back on it is a feeling of being of service to the people who served with me, and also the feeling, the noble calling of being of service to this country. It's probably the most important aspect of life in the military.
It is his strength of character, his service in the U.S. Air Force, and his dedication to our nation's defense that make General Charles Albert Horner a legend of air power.